Genesis chapter 12, verse number 1. I'm glad to see everybody. I hope you came hungry. Joe, I caught Joe. He's back there trying to sample the food, but I think Glenn got a hold of him and said, "We can't. That's not right. We can't do that." Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I just what I thought I saw. Sometimes we're wrong what we thought we saw. Genesis chapter 12. Remember when you were young and events happened in your life, and then you look back later and you realize those events may even prove to be a big life-changing event. Has that ever happened to you? It didn't seem that way when we were young. I mean, or even younger people. A chance meeting, somebody you meet by chance, or a knock on the door, can result in 50 plus years of marriage and maybe even 60. How much? 65. It can work out that way, and you look back. It's a lifelong friendship, even, and you look back at your life and you didn't realize it at the time, but my gracious. It's a miracle. In Genesis chapter 12, it's one of these moments. It affects the history of the world forever. Not only changing the course of the people that we're going to be looking at, but it changes the course of history. It changes the course of our lives as individuals. And this is what this chapter does. It's a landmark in the nation of Israel, the world history and gospel. The call of Abraham was a turning point. It began here we're going to look at with Abraham 2,000 years later. It's a Roman cross. And it's still unfolding today in our lives as Christians. That this history continues to grow and develop. Chapter 11 that we've studied of Genesis is a story of man's downward spiral in sin. And despite God's grace all along the way, Adam and Eve's choice marked them for shame, sinful rebellion, and Noah was called by God, and Noah was a man of God, and he saved all humanity. Then the Tower of Babel in chapter 11, when God saw the people's plans and motives, and it was an affront to God, and he wanted to scatter them, and he did. And then he was going to make a name for themselves through Abraham, and all the nations of the whole entire world will be blessed. So Genesis chapter 12, beginning, let's read verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." I want to back up because I want you to notice in chapter 11, beginning at verse 31. Terah, that's Abraham's son, took Abram his son and Lot the son of Haran and grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of Chaldees in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. Then the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. The reason is, I want you to remember that. He's 205 years. God has a plan. I want you to take your family, he's telling Abraham, and everything you got, and I want you to leave, or I will show you. But it didn't include Terah, Abraham's father. So they go from Ur of Chaldees, where he's from. They get to Haran, however you want to say it. And there he dies, and then the journey begins with just Abraham and his family. So that's the reason I wanted you to look at that. And so in verses 1 through 3, the promise of God in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, bringing Jesus Christ into the world, required actions of men, including this right here. And through his seed, Jesus comes. It is, I don't know how to... and for that to happen, this family has to be chosen, and then it has to go through and bring Jesus Christ into the world. I hope I'm explaining what I'm trying to say. Verse 1, now the Lord said to Abram. Now, Abraham's first journey began back that I just looked at with you, chapter 11, verse 31 and 32, from Ur of Chaldees. That's where he's from. It's where his home is. That's where everything he owns. That's where his family is. Everything that means anything to him is in Ur of Chaldees, and they leave and they go to Haran. Nehemiah, if you want to look at Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 7 and 8, Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 7 and 8. I like this because it deals exactly as what we're studying. Nehemiah 9, verse 7 and 8. You are the Lord God who chose Abram and brought him out from Ur of Chaldees and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you and made a covenant with you. I think that's so wonderful. It fits it. Well, it's talking exactly about what we're studying. So God's command for Abraham to leave included leaving his country, his family, his father's house. Now here's the thing, how old is Abraham when he takes up and loads everything up and hooks it? Do you know? He's 75 years old. He's 75 years old when he leaves. I wonder what we would do. You know, at 75 years old, we're pretty set in our ways. And if we've been living in the same place for 75 years, and then all of a sudden you have to pick up roots and leave your family and all your relatives and all of that and take your family and Lot and his family and go. Boy, that's faith. Because we're pretty set in our ways when we get a little older, like Abraham here. And not only that, he didn't even know where he's going. When you look at the closer impact on Abraham, and you see that it took faith and courage for him to do that. I try to put myself in that place. What would we do? We'd get a U-Haul and we'd fill that thing to the brim where you could barely even close the door, and you'd get in your car and your truck and you'd follow somebody drive the U-Haul, and you don't even have any idea where you're going, and you just take off. And that's exactly the way it was for them. It was giving up everything that he knew, he had ever known. Abraham's 75 years old. You want to stay put, but God had a plan for him. And God has a plan for us. God had a plan for Abraham to bring Jesus Christ into the world, an inheritance, property, all the family members he had, and they're loading up and they're going on. And I always like to think, when you read chapter 12, chapter 13, it don't matter, read all the way through about Abraham. And every time he got someplace, he built an altar to God, thanking him and worshiping him and praising him and glorifying him. And so it's been said that you could follow the trail of Abraham in the route he took from altar to altar. And I believe that's probably a pretty safe way of saying it, because he did. You know, he didn't have any idea where God was sending him. So that took faith. God's promise of a land that's going to replace everything he's leaving behind. It's interesting that, to me, that God made all these promises to Abraham, and he's leaving this and all he had, all his land and everything he owned, to a place that God says, I'm going to give you new. And it's interesting that Abraham never owned any land in Canaan. You know the only thing he ever owned? Do you have any idea? You remember? He owned two things. Well, maybe one. I don't know. I think one thing that he owned in the land of Canaan. Do you remember what that was? Yes. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Where he buried Sarah in that family plot. That's it. That's all he owned there. Because he was totally following and obeying God. He was a man of faith, and moving away got him also away from something else. If you study about that area, those people worshipped idols. They worshipped anything in that area he was located at. And so God got him away from that too, if you really think about it. He got him from an area away from where people worship that way. He got him into an area to serve the one true and living God. And on this trip, he'll learn some hard lessons. Boy, you study about Abraham and you see all these things that occurred to him, and he learned some hard lessons. But all of those lessons made him stronger in faith and obedience to God. Is that what happens to us today? Things that occur in our life, does it make us stronger or weaker? Depends on our outlook, doesn't it? It does. And if we have a good attitude about this, what these things that are happening to us, and they may be hard lessons to learn, but we learned in faith, and we became stronger in faith and more obedient to God, the things that happen sometimes in our life. So in verse 2 and 3, in the call of Abraham, he was with the faithful. He had faithful and sure promises. He going to come to a land, a nation, and all the spiritual promises that he gives him. In verses 2 and 3, there are 7 individual promises right there in those 2 verses. 7 promises that he promises to Abraham. You can count them. The first one is God promised to make him a great nation. This would be a test of Abraham's faith. He's 75 years old, and his wife is barren. She has no children, and he's 75. They have no children. What kind of faith is that going to take to test you that you're going to become the father of a great nation? When you look at it that way, it's amazing. His faith in God. He knew nothing was too hard for God. Let me ask you a question. Is it the same today? Is nothing too hard for God? I mean, we live in the worst. One of my doctors is in Dallas, and I don't even want to go there. I don't even want to go. I want a doctor to replace him in Waxahachie or somewhere. I don't even want to go to Dallas because I'm afraid I'll be driving along and I'll do something in that vehicle that'll make somebody mad that I didn't even know I did, and they'll fill my car full of 45 ammunition. You know, it's a terrible place, and I don't want to be negative either. This is a terrible world we live in. But boy, we have more opportunities, and God's blessed us with more opportunities than any other time in history. So there's nothing too hard for God, even today. From the seed of Abraham is going to come an entire nation, and Jesus Christ is going to come into the world. And later, God is going to tell Abraham in chapters 15 and 22 that his seed is going to be as numerous as sand on the seashore at his age. as many as the stars in the sky. Did you see the stars last night? Oh, man. Breathtaking. I always try to do that. You can see the Milky Way and all these other galaxies and stars. And God tells Abraham, your seed is going to be numerous as the stars in heaven, stars in the sky. Multiple nations would come. And from the descendants, he didn't even have one child born yet. So the second promise, that he'd bless Abraham, the word is found 5 times in these 2 verses. Bless Abraham. The word blessing is found more in Genesis than any other book in the Old Testament. It denotes protection, provision, guidance, long life, deliverance, victory, peace. All these things are promised to him by God. Does he promise peace with us today? He gives, thank you, Sharon. He gives us peace that is not just like peace of the world, is it? He gives us a peace that passes all understanding. There we go. Now the third promise. God promises him a great name. And this is quite a contrast with what God offers to Abraham through his faithful obedience to God. He's going to give him a great name. You compare that and you contrast that with the Tower of Babel. And all they wanted was to make their own merits and their own accomplishments, and it was all about them. But here, God is contrasting that between Abraham, what he's going to do, faithful obedience to Almighty God. And I'll make you a great nation. Everyone desires a good reputation, don't we? We all want a good reputation. We want a name that others recognize and respect. We want a good name. It's praiseworthy. It's more valuable than riches. Proverbs 22 and verse 1, a good name is to be desired more than great wealth. So Abraham had that name. He received that name, Abraham. And that name and his life gave glory to God. New test for Abraham. He's called a friend of God, James 2 and verse 23. He's called a father of the faithful, Romans 4 and verse 16. It might not have happened that way, or in the time Abraham thought that God would make a great name for himself, because he never owned any land in Canaan. The fourth promise. God promised he'd be a blessing. His good name would be used for good purposes. And Abraham will offer provisions and protection and deliverance and guidance for those that are with him. How do we know he'd provide all that protection and guidance for those who are with him? Can you give me an example of those that were with him and that were protected and guided? And Lot, his nephew. Abraham's calmness in dealing with conflict with Lot in chapter 13. I always think of his intercession he made with God on behalf of Lot. Do you remember how many it started with? And when God's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham starts to negotiate. Did that take courage to negotiate with God? Oh, you can read all about it. And do you remember how many it started with? If you can just find 50, if we can find 50 righteous people, will you spare the city? If you find 50, I'll spare the city. It didn't stop there, did it? Well, how about 45? yeah, I'll spare it. How about 40? It keeps going down. 30, 20, 10. And God knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to save Lot, his family. He's trying to spare destruction. And so God was patient with him. And he got him to 10, but Abraham, they couldn't find 10 righteous. Abraham was a blessing to the world that he lived in. He's a blessing to our world we live in. So the 5th and 6th promises. God promised to bless those who Abraham blessed who Abraham blessed, that's what I'm trying to say, and to curse those that he cursed. Isaac used these words in his blessing he gave to Jacob in Genesis 27, verse 29. The 7th promise in Abraham, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. It's repeated. It's also repeated in Genesis 22, verse 18, and both in Isaac and Jacob, Genesis 26 and verse 28, he promises that to them. In his seed, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, comes into the world, Matthew 1 and verse 1. So that promise is promised in Isaac, it's promised in Jacob, and it originated in Abraham. His seed, and how that affects us today with the Savior of the world. Verse 4 and 5. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abraham took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. So, if you want to look at Acts chapter 7 with me, Acts chapter 7 and verse 4. Let's read that one now that we've read verse 4 and 5. Acts chapter 7 and verse 4. Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this country in which you are now living. So, in Acts chapter 7, verse 4. So, aided by the assurances of the promise of God, Abraham, Sarah, Lot, his servants, they set out on a journey of about 500 miles, 400 or 500 miles. And they traveled first from Ur of Chaldees with their father till they got to Haran. Their father died, Abraham's father died in Haran, and now he'd just taken his family just the way God promised it to them. That makes sense to you? The average rate of travel is going to go 400 to 500 miles. The average rate of travel, and I think this is probably too much. 20 miles a day. I doubt they could make 20 miles a day. They got camels, they got sheep, they got goats and all that. And not to mention the dangers that you might run into. They left the area where they had plenty of water. They had plenty of water in Ur Chaldees, and they had plenty of water in Haran. You know why? Because all those rivers that run through that area in the Euphrates River Valley. So they had plenty of water. It was pretty good living right there. They were traveling through the area. It was fertile. They had plenty of grass and plenty of water. Verse 6 and 7. Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, to the oak of Moriah. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. The Shechem is an important city in Old Testament times. It was located in a pass between two mountain peaks. I'm going to challenge you here. This Shechem, there were two mountain peaks, and it was a place that is called the Valley of Decision. It's called the area of blessings and cursings. Do you remember the two mountains? Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Remember that? Remember that? Only reason I can remember is because the woman at the well, when she's talking to Jesus, think back to what she said. Your fathers say in Jerusalem is the place to worship. Well, our fathers say on this mountain is the place to worship. This is one of these mountains he's talking about. Man, girds them. And what does Jesus say to her? The day's coming when neither on this mountain or in Jerusalem will be the place to worship. But you will worship the Father how? In spirit and in truth. Yeah. So there's a choice here for the Israelites. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, too, he gave them the choice. Are you going to serve God, or are you going to serve false gods? Also right here in Joshua chapter 24, the same area. Joshua said, for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. See, so it's valleys of decision all in this area. The terebinth tree of Moreh, a land that was not yet Abraham's. The Canaanites were still there, weren't they? But they would struggle with Abraham and his descendants for generations and generations. Abraham had God's continued protection all through this. And if you remember, if anyone dishonored Abraham, it would not be good, because you would get a curse by God. If you're gracious and favorable, then it would respond to you in the same way, by God, in kind, gracious. This was the first major stop here where they are. And there are two things that happened. First, God spoke to Abraham again and gave him that promise that he had been giving him. And the second thing they did there is Abraham built that altar. So Abraham, there's two things: promise of God, Abraham's seed, but it was not at this time. It was on God's time that all of this would be fulfilled. Here's what I think in my mind. After God made all them promises to him, I think it'd be like Kenneth out there on his land. If God made that promise to him and he knew that place was going to be his, I'd want to reach down and grab some dirt and hold it in my hand and say, this is mine. This is going to be mine. God's going to give this to me. And then fall on your face in prayer to God. And it had to be, I don't know if he did that, but he knew later that land's going to be theirs. So Abraham built an altar there to worship and sacrifice to God. Abraham was called the father of the faithful. And you could follow Abraham in all his journeys, going from altar to altar to altar that he built every bit of way. Anybody want to add anything? Yes, sir. Yeah.
I was afraid that how often this place is, but this is none other than the house of God.
Yeah.
So that was there.
Yeah.
And you look at, when they were at Bethel, it was pretty well doing pretty good. Once they started moving away from Bethel, they started getting away from God, they started messing up and things like that.
Yeah.
That's the story today. This is the house of God, church is. And once we start moving away from that church, from the church, then we become weaker and weaker and things start happening.
Yeah. It is amazing that at Bethel, Jacob spent the night there, and he had his head on a rock. Do you remember that? And what did he see in the vision? Jacob see in the vision? He's sleeping on a rock. No, you know, that'd be pretty rough. But what vision did he? Yeah, he saw what? the staircase going from earth to heaven, and Jesus on the top, making him that promise again for it's going to be fulfilled to his family. And so Jacob took the rock that he had his head on, and he made not an altar. Yeah. What do you call it? It wasn't an altar. It was. Well, anyway, yeah. he's commemorating that place, and he pours oil on top, and he calls the name of the place Bethel. Not long after that, it wasn't at Bethel, but who did he wrestle with? And the reason I'm bringing this up, you reminded me, and you're exactly right. You reminded me of some of these things. If you haven't studied about the life of Jacob, oh boy, you got to do that. It is so amazing. In fact, there are a lot I'm going to be preaching about. It's going to be about that. What a life he led. He would dig up wells and find wells and build wells, and here come the other heathens, and they'd fill it up. Well, they just went back and forth digging wells and filling up wells.